Imagine a world where a mighty empire seems unshakable, its laws and order extending over vast territories. But even within the strongest walls, a spark sometimes ignites, capable of igniting a flame that shakes the very foundations of this greatness. Today we will travel to the Roman Republic on the eve of one of the most dramatic events in its history, the slave revolt led by Spartacus. What led to this monumental conflict? What were the conditions that made such a massive uprising possible? To understand the origins of the revolt, we need to look at the socio-economic fabric of Rome at the time, around the middle of the 1st century BCE. Roman civilization, renowned for its legions and conquests, built its prosperity on a foundation that today seems quite bleak. Slavery wasn't just part of the Roman economy, it was its foundation. Huge numbers of people captured during endless wars were turned into property, into a labor force deprived of all rights. These people toiled in the fields, in the mines, and in the homes of wealthy citizens, ensuring the prosperity of the Roman Republic. As Roman power grew and its territories expanded, so did the number of slaves, and with it the size of their landholdings, the so-called latifundia. These vast estates, owned by the Roman aristocracy, became increasingly profitable, but working conditions were often intolerable. Slaves worked from dawn to dusk, under the watchful eye of cruel overseers, their lives dependent on the whims of their masters. They were deprived of names, families, freedom, everything that makes a person human. It was precisely this mass of dispossessed, deprived of everything, that constituted a potential source of discontent, and, as history has shown, a force for resistance. At the same time, the Roman Republic possessed unprecedented military might. Its legions, disciplined, well-trained, and equipped, were a machine of conquest that subjugated countless nations. Roman traditions of military prowess and constant campaigning kept this military apparatus in constant readiness. Conquests not only brought new territories and resources, but also swelled the ranks of slaves, perpetuating a vicious cycle. The army was a symbol of Roman dominance, but it was in its shadow, far from the parade grounds, that forces ripened to challenge that power. An interesting, if disturbing, aspect of Roman culture were the gladiatorial games. These immensely popular spectacles featured duels between armed slaves, criminals, or volunteers. Gladiators, often strong and well-trained, were objects of admiration, but their lives were as disenfranchised as those of other slaves. They lived in special schools where they underwent rigorous training under the guidance of experienced trainers. For many, gladiatorial school was a place where they were prepared for death. But for others, it was also a place where they had their first opportunity to prove themselves, survive, and perhaps achieve a semblance of glory, albeit in the arena. It was from such a school, from among gladiators, that the man whose name would forever be etched into history would emerge. Spartacus's identity before the rebellion is shrouded in mystery, but the sources we have paint him as an extraordinary man. Some sources say he hailed from Thrace, a region known for its warlike tribes. He may have been a warrior captured by the Romans, or even a deserter from the Roman army, which would explain his military skills and understanding of Roman tactics. Other sources, point to his origins in a noble Thracian family. Whatever the case, Spartacus ended up in a gladiatorial school in Capua, a city renowned for its arenas and gladiatorial combat. He was a gladiator, but within him likely glimmered a spark of freedom, a yearning for a life different from the one destined for him. It was in this gladiatorial school, owned by a certain Lentulus Batiatus in Capua, that the rebellion began in 73 BC. The school was known for its cruelty and strict discipline. The conditions in which the gladiators were kept were such that, according to historians, they were preparing for death, not a life of slavery. When plans for their subsequent sale and possible extermination became known, a group of about 70 gladiators decided to act. The escape was organized secretly. Armed with kitchen knives and other improvised tools, they broke through the guards. Their initial successes inspired other slaves in the surrounding area, and the gladiators began to be joined by runaway slaves, peasants, and anyone suffering under Roman oppression. Spartacus, along with other gladiators such as Crixus and Oenomaus, became one of the leaders of this nascent movement. Spartacus likely possessed the charisma and military talent that allowed him to unite such a diverse crowd. Crixus may have been a Gaul, and Oenomaus a German, suggesting the multinational composition of the early rebels. The Roman authorities, underestimating the seriousness of the threat, sent small detachments against the rebels. These initial clashes were unequal. The rebels, although poorly armed, fought with desperation and fury. They used whatever weapons they could find, as well as whatever they could seize from the Romans. Their tactics were simple: attack, taking advantage of their numerical superiority and knowledge of the terrain where they could hide. To Rome's surprise, these detachments were not routed. On the contrary, they won several victories, which only spurred the rebellion on. 73 BCE marked a turning point. The gladiator corps, led by Spartacus, Crixus, and Oenomaus, transformed from fugitives into an organized force. New supporters began to flock to them. Runaway slaves from the surrounding estates, landless peasants dissatisfied with their situation, and freedmen who had found no place in Roman society. This motley crowd, united by a common desire for freedom, began to form a veritable army. Despite the lack of professional training, the rebels learned quickly. Discipline, though different from Roman, was gradually established. They captured Roman weapons and armor, which allowed them to fight more effectively. Their tactics often relied on surprise and exploiting the terrain. They avoided direct clashes with large Roman forces, preferring to attack small detachments and supply trains. The rebels' first real test came when Rome sent more serious forces against them. Consular armies, composed of well-trained legionaries, were dispatched. However, to the Romans' great surprise, these expeditionary forces were routed. Spartacus proved himself a talented commander, skillfully exploiting the enemy's weaknesses and his own army's strengths. He avoided open battles, preferring maneuver warfare, ambushes, and swift strikes. Spartacus's strategic decisions were aimed at survival and finding a path to freedom. After initial successes in northern Italy, he decided to move south. This may have been due to a desire to escape the main Roman forces, which were concentrated in the north, or in the hope of finding a way to leave Italy, perhaps through ports in the south. One of Spartacus's most famous military successes occurred at Vesuvius. The Romans, believing the rebels cornered on the mountain slopes, decided to lay siege to them. However, Spartacus, displaying remarkable ingenuity, descended the mountain using ropes woven from grapevines, outflanked the Roman positions, and attacked them from the rear. This battle was a crushing defeat for the Romans. The rebels captured a huge amount of weapons, armor, and supplies, significantly strengthening their army. Following this victory, the rebels' territory of control began to expand. Southern Italy became their primary arena of operations. They plundered estates, freed slaves, and their numbers grew daily. During this period, the first serious division within the rebel army occurred. Crixus, along with his group, chose to remain in southern Italy, possibly focusing on plunder and booty. This group was later routed by Roman troops, a tragic lesson for the rebels. Spartacus, eager to leave Italy, attempted to negotiate with the Cilician pirates who then dominated the seas. He hoped they would transport his army to Sicily, where perhaps there were more slaves willing to join the rebellion, or to the Balkans to return to their homeland. However, the pirates, having received Spartacus's money, failed to fulfill their promises. This failure meant that Spartacus's army was trapped in Italy, facing the full might of the Roman state. Rome finally realized the gravity of the threat. Alarmed by the failures of its armies, the Senate took unprecedented measures. 2 proconsuls were appointed, each wielding enormous powers. Gnaeus Pompey, already renowned for his military successes, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of Rome's wealthiest men, who, seeking a political career, invested heavily in suppressing the rebellion. Crassus bore the brunt of the fighting. His strategy was to consolidate his position and methodically suppress the rebellion. He assembled 8 legions, amounting to approximately 40,000 soldiers. Crassus began the siege of Rhegium, a city where some of the rebels were stationed. After a fierce struggle, the city was captured, and its inhabitants, according to sources, were cruelly punished. Crassus's main objective was to cut off Spartacus's army in southern Italy. He began constructing massive fortifications, a ditch and rampart stretching across the entire narrow stretch of Bruttium, to prevent the rebels from breaking through to the north. This was a massive engineering feat designed to trap Spartacus on the peninsula. Meanwhile, Pompey, stationed in the north, also played his part. He was engaged in combating the remnants of Crixus's army, which, as mentioned, had been routed. Furthermore, Pompey intercepted groups of fugitives attempting to break through to the north or leave Italy. Thus, the Roman forces acted in a coordinated manner, attempting to squeeze Spartacus's army into a vice. Despite all the Roman efforts, Spartacus did not give up. In 71 BC, finding himself trapped in the south, he decided to break through Crassus's fortifications to the north. The reasons for this decision may have varied. Perhaps he saw that remaining in the south would inevitably lead to his army's destruction from hunger and disease, or perhaps he hoped to break through weakened defenses. In a series of fierce battles, the rebels managed to break through Crassus's fortified line. In these clashes, they once again demonstrated their tenacity and fighting ability, inflicting a number of defeats on individual Roman legates. However, the forces were unequal. The Roman army, superior in numbers, discipline, and weapons, gradually gained the upper hand. The culmination was a decisive battle, which, according to most historians, took place in Lucania. Spartacus, facing Crassus's main army, accepted combat. The details of this battle are unclear, but it is known that it was extremely bloody. Spartacus, according to sources, fought in the front ranks, trying to reach Crassus himself. He was wounded, but continued to fight until he fell under the onslaught of the Roman legionaries. His death likely marked the turning point in the battle, demoralizing the remaining rebels. After Spartacus's death, the remnants of his army were scattered. The Romans achieved a complete victory. The brutality with which the rebellion was suppressed is astounding even by the standards of antiquity. Thousands of rebels were executed. Along the Appian Way from Capua to Rome, some 6,000 captive slaves were crucified. This was not just a punishment, but a terrifying example for anyone who might contemplate such a rebellion. The spoils gained from suppressing the rebellion were enormous. Crassus and Pompey, claiming credit for the victory, held triumphs in Rome, demonstrating their power and grandeur. Spartacus's rebellion, though brutally suppressed, left a deep mark on Roman society. It forced the Romans to reconsider their attitude toward slaves, though not in a more humane direction. On the contrary, slave control was tightened, and new laws were passed aimed at preventing similar rebellions. Sources of information about Spartacus's revolt are scant and often biased. We draw our primary information from the works of Roman historians, such as Plutarch, Appian, and Sallust. These authors wrote some time after the events, and their accounts may contain interpretations and conjectures. Nevertheless, they are the ones who have preserved the historical record. If we have knowledge of the events that became a turning point in the history of the Roman Republic, let's return to the beginning of this momentous and tragic event. It was 73 BCE. The Roman Republic, a powerful empire stretching from Britain to North Africa, was experiencing a period of internal tension. The economy, largely built on slave labor, was growing, but so was discontent. The vast estates, or latifundia, owned by aristocrats required ever more labor, and these laborers belonged primarily to enslaved people. Their situation was disenfranchised, and their lives were hard. Rome's military might was undeniable. Its disciplined and well-trained legions won numerous victories, expanding the Republic's borders. Military service was honorable, and the traditions associated with the army were deeply ingrained in Roman society. But behind the glitter of conquests lurked a dark side. One such aspect was the gladiatorial games. These spectacles, intended to entertain the Romans, often claimed human lives. Gladiators, many of whom were slaves, prisoners of war, or convicted criminals, trained in special schools, preparing for mortal combat. Their lives were harsh, and their training grueling. It was in one such school, located in the city of Capua, that the rebellion began. The school belonged to a certain Lentulus Batiatus. It was an establishment where gladiators were housed and trained for the arena. Life there was regimented and strictly disciplined, But, of course, it couldn't compare to the conditions in the fields or quarries. Nevertheless, it was a place where those at the very bottom of the social ladder could find, however elusive, hope for survival, and sometimes even glory. But for many gladiators, even this life was unbearable. In 73 BC, a group of over 200, dissatisfied with their situation and harsh treatment, decided to escape. The organizer of this escape, according to sources, was a man named Spartacus. His origins are uncertain. Some believe he was a Thracian, others a member of the Massagettai tribe. He could have been a captured warrior or even a deserter from the Roman army. In any case, before his time at the gladiator school, he likely had combat experience and understood how to lead men. The escape was quite daring. The gladiators, armed with kitchen knives and other improvised weapons, managed to break out of the school. There weren't many of them, but they were determined. Their initial successes emboldened them. They managed to capture wagons carrying gladiatorial weapons, significantly improving their equipment. Other gladiators also joined Spartacus. Among them were figures such as Crixus and Onamos. Crixus was believed to have been a Gaul, while Onamos was a German. They became Spartacus's closest allies, and their roles in organizing and leading the rebellion were quite significant. Together, these three leaders were able to unite the disparate groups of runaway gladiators. The Roman authorities, of course, couldn't ignore this rebellion. The first troops were dispatched to suppress the uprising. These were likely small units composed of citizen militia or specially conscripted troops. Their weapons and tactics were designed for routine clashes, but they encountered an unexpected enemy. The gladiators, although lacking full military training, were trained in combat, knew how to wield weapons, and were driven by desperation and a thirst for freedom. Their numbers, though small at first, steadily grew. Soon after their escape from Capua, the rebels, led by Spartacus, Crixus, and Onomaus, began attracting new supporters. They were joined not only by runaway slaves from the surrounding estates, but also by free peasants whose lands had been plundered or confiscated, as well as freedmen who had found themselves in dire straits. This was no longer just a band of gladiators. It was forming a true army, united by a common goal, the struggle for freedom. The organization of this army was impressive, considering its diverse composition. Spartacus and his comrades managed to establish discipline, delegate responsibilities, and provide the rebels with weapons. They captured Roman military camps, taking weapons and armor from defeated soldiers. The tactics they employed often surprised the Romans. They utilized their knowledge of the terrain, swift raids, and skillfully exploited their numerical superiority when it became available. The initial clashes with Roman troops were successful for the rebels. They managed to defeat several small expeditionary forces sent to suppress them. These victories further strengthened the authority of Spartacus and his supporters. The troops commanded by legates or officers subordinate to the consuls were routed. The consuls, the highest officials in the Republic, were responsible for military campaigns, but the initial attempts to suppress the rebellion failed. Spartacus's strategic decisions were far-sighted. Realizing that remaining in place was dangerous, he decided to move to southern Italy. This was a wise move, as the southern regions were less densely populated by Roman citizens and had a larger number of slaves willing to join the rebellion. Furthermore, southern Italy had access to the sea, which he hoped would open up opportunities for further retreat or assistance. Soon after, one of the most famous battles of the period took place, the Battle of Vesuvius. Spartacus and his army found themselves trapped on the slopes of Mount Vesuvius. The Romans, confident of victory, decided to besiege them, blocking the only access to the mountain. But Spartacus, displaying remarkable ingenuity, used wild grapevines to climb down the steep slope, outflanking the Roman positions. The Romans, unprepared for such a maneuver, found themselves in disarray. The rebels suddenly attacked their camp from the rear, causing panic and the complete rout of the Roman army. They captured a large quantity of weapons and armor, further strengthening their army. Following this victory, the rebels' territory of control expanded. Southern Italy became their main base. They were also able to extend their influence to Sicily, an island that had been the center of previous major slave revolts. However, the situation there developed differently. Despite their successes, dissension began to arise within the rebel army. Crixus, possibly with a group of his comrades, decided to break away from Spartacus's main army. The reasons for this split are unclear. Perhaps it was a disagreement over strategy, or a desire to plunder and seize territory independently. In any case, Crixus and his men were routed by the Roman troops. This was the first serious blow to the rebels' unity. Spartacus, realizing that remaining in Italy could lead to the complete destruction of his army, attempted to leave the peninsula. He negotiated with the Cilician pirates who controlled the Mediterranean sea routes. His plan was to transport his army to Sicily or Africa, where they could continue the fight or find refuge. However, the deal with the pirates fell through. Either the pirates deceived Spartacus, taking payment but not providing ships, or they were intercepted by the Roman fleet. In any case, the attempt to leave Italy failed. By 72 BCE, the Roman response had become more decisive. The Republic recognized the full gravity of the threat. 2 experienced and influential generals were appointed to suppress the rebellion. Gaius Pompey, who had just returned from a successful campaign in Spain, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of Rome's wealthiest men, eager for military glory. Crassus's strategy was to isolate Spartacus and his army in southern Italy. He began to strengthen his position, constructing defensive lines and fortifications. He paid particular attention to the city of Rhegium, located at the southernmost point of the peninsula. Crassus besieged and captured Rhegium, thereby cutting off Spartacus's escape routes. Then, to completely bottle up the rebels in the south, he undertook a monumental engineering feat, constructing a massive rampart and ditch across the entire tip of Bruttium. This ditch, some 55 kilometers long, was intended to prevent Spartacus from breaking through to the north. At the same time, Pompey, operating in the north, was engaged in combating the remnants of Crixus's army, which had not yet been completely destroyed, and intercepting groups of runaway slaves attempting to flee Italy. Thus, the Romans employed a dual strategy. Crassus attempted to corner Spartacus in the south, while Pompey tried to prevent his escape and finish off the scattered troops. Despite the Romans' best efforts, Spartacus managed to demonstrate his military cunning once again. Trapped behind Crassus's fortifications, he and his army managed to break through the defenses at one point where they had been weakened by natural conditions or neglect. They found themselves free again, but their situation was dire. In 71 BC, Spartacus's final campaign began. Faced with superior Roman forces and realizing that any further stay in the south was doomed, he decided to fight his way north, hoping to escape Italy through the Alps. It was risky, but perhaps his only chance. The rebel army, exhausted but still combat-ready, engaged Crassus's legates. Spartacus won several victories, routing Roman troops and demonstrating his unrivaled military prowess. However, the odds were unequal. Crassus, with vast resources and disciplined legions, was steadily closing in. The decisive battle took place in Lucania. The exact location is unknown, but it was here that Spartacus's main forces met the Roman army under Crassus. Spartacus, according to sources, fought in the front ranks, trying to reach Crassus himself. He was wounded, but continued to fight until he fell under the onslaught of the Roman legionaries. His death likely marked the turning point in the battle, demoralizing the remaining rebels. After Spartacus's death, the remnants of his army were scattered. The Romans achieved a complete victory. The brutality with which the rebellion was suppressed is astounding even by the standards of antiquity. Thousands of rebels were executed. Along the Appian Way, from Capua to Rome, some 6,000 captive slaves were crucified. This was not just a punishment, but a terrifying example for anyone who might contemplate such a rebellion. The spoils gained from suppressing the rebellion were enormous. Crassus and Pompey, claiming credit for the victory, held triumphs in Rome, demonstrating their power and grandeur. Spartacus's rebellion, though brutally suppressed, left a deep mark on Roman society. It forced the Romans to reconsider their attitude toward slaves, though not in a more humane direction. On the contrary, slave control was tightened, and new laws were passed aimed at preventing similar rebellions. Sources of information about Spartacus's revolt are scant and often biased. We draw our primary information from the works of Roman historians such as Plutarch, Appian, and Sallust. These authors wrote some time after the events, and their accounts may contain interpretations and conjectures. Nevertheless, it is they who have brought us knowledge of the events that marked a turning point in the history of the Roman Republic. The Roman Republic, on the eve of the 3rd century BCE, was a state whose power and influence grew with each passing decade. This power was based not only on its military machine, but also on a complex socio-economic system in which slavery played a key role. Millions of people captured during numerous conquests became the property of Roman citizens. They cultivated the land, built cities, worked in workshops, and even acted as personal servants. This system allowed Roman citizens to engage in politics, military affairs, and the arts, freeing them from arduous physical labor. As the Roman state developed, the phenomenon of latifundia, vast landholdings owned by wealthy landowners, grew. These lands were largely labored by slaves, often under extremely harsh conditions, comparable to slave labor at its most severe. Their lives were unpredictable, dependent on the will of their masters, and rarely offered the possibility of freedom. The Roman army, by contrast, was a model of discipline and organization. Legions composed of rigorously trained citizens were capable of achieving victories over the most formidable opponents. Traditions of military valor and glory were deeply ingrained in Roman society, and military success was one of the main paths to political influence and social recognition. Conquests brought Rome not only new territories and resources, but also vast numbers of slaves, which perpetuated the vicious cycle of the Roman economy. Along with military might, Roman society also celebrated such spectacles as gladiatorial games. Held in amphitheaters, these games were not just entertainment, but also an important part of public life, demonstrating the strength and brutality of the Roman state. Gladiators, often slaves or prisoners of war, underwent rigorous training in special schools. Their living conditions were Spartan, and their chances of survival were slim. Nevertheless, for some gladiators, these games became an opportunity to gain glory, and, in rare cases, even freedom. It was in this environment, where slavery was the norm and violence a part of everyday life, that the figure of Spartacus emerged. Little is known about his origins before the revolt, but most sources agree that he was a Thracian, possibly serving in the Roman army as an auxiliary. His subsequent fate led him to slavery, and then to the gladiatorial school in Capua. It's difficult to say for certain what kind of person Spartacus was before he became the leader of the revolt, but his subsequent actions testify to exceptional leadership qualities, strategic thinking, and a deep desire for freedom. The 7th century BC was a time of significant change for the Roman Republic, and one of the most dramatic events was the slave revolt known as Spartacus's Revolt. It began in the 7th decade of the Common Era, specifically in 73 BC, with the escape of gladiators from the school of Lentulus Batiatus in Capua. This school was one of the most renowned in Italy, housing approximately 200 gladiators training for the arena. Conditions were harsh and life was bleak. In 73 BC, realizing their situation, and perhaps inspired by the spirit of struggle, a group of gladiators, including Spartacus and his comrades, Crixus and Oenomaus, decided to escape. Their plan was bold and risky. Using kitchen knives and other improvised weapons, they managed to break out of the school, killing the guards. Their initial encounters with the Roman detachments sent to capture them proved unexpectedly successful for the gladiators. Armed only with what they could grab, and driven by rage and a desire to survive, they demonstrated remarkable resilience and tactical acumen. Soon, the band of fugitive gladiators began to be joined by other slaves who had escaped from nearby estates, as well as impoverished peasants and freedmen. These were men whose lives were full of hardship and injustice, and they saw in Spartacus and his men the hope of liberation. Thus, the small band of gladiators gradually transformed into an organized army. Spartacus, Crixus, and Oenomaus became the key leaders of this movement, each contributing to the rebels' success. Spartacus, considered to possess the greatest authority and strategic vision, assumed primary leadership. The rebel army, although composed primarily of untrained men, was highly motivated and sought discipline. They captured weapons and armor from Roman soldiers, allowing them to gradually improve their equipment. The first clashes with Roman units, composed of poorly trained or inexperienced soldiers, ended in defeat for the Romans. The rebels' weapons, although varied, included both gladiatorial weapons and those captured from the enemy. Spartacus's tactics, based on surprise attacks and exploiting the terrain, proved highly effective against the more numerous but less mobile Roman units. The Roman authorities, underestimating the scale of the threat, sent small expeditionary forces against the rebels. These forces, consisting of several thousand soldiers, were routed. One of the first such clashes was the defeat of a detachment under the command of the praetor Gaius Claudius Glaber, who attempted to block Spartacus on Mount Vesuvius. The Romans, confident of victory, did not expect the rebels to find a way out of their seemingly hopeless situation. Spartacus's strategic decisions during this period were aimed at preserving and strengthening his army. Instead of attempting to break through north toward Rome, he decided to advance to the south of Italy. This decision was likely motivated by a desire to avoid direct clashes with the main Roman army, which had not yet been fully mobilized, as well as a desire to find safer territories to organize and train his men. In 73 BC, following a successful escape from the gladiatorial school in Capua, Spartacus's army began to grow rapidly. The fugitive gladiators were joined by thousands of slaves fleeing farmland, as well as impoverished peasants and freedmen dissatisfied with their situation. These people, deprived of everything, saw rebellion as their only chance of freedom and a better life. Spartacus, Crixus, and Onomas, as leaders, made efforts to organize this heterogeneous mass into something resembling an army. They sought to instill discipline in their followers, a difficult task given their backgrounds and lack of military experience. Nevertheless, a thirst for freedom and a common goal fostered unity. The rebels' weapons were extremely diverse. From gladiatorial weapons such as swords, daggers, and shields, to agricultural implements, which could serve as improvised weapons. They also actively seized weapons and armor from Roman soldiers, which gradually improved their fighting ability. The initial clashes with the Roman troops sent to suppress the rebellion ended in unexpected defeat for the Romans. Accustomed to disciplined legions, the Romans underestimated the resolve and resourcefulness of the rebels. Spartacus's tactics, based on surprise attacks and exploitation of the terrain, proved highly effective. For example, at the Battle of Vesuvius, when a Roman detachment under the command of the praetor Gaius Claudius Glaber attempted to block the rebels on a mountainside, Spartacus ordered his men to weave ladders from grapevines and descend the sheer cliff face, outflanking the Romans. The Romans, caught off guard, were completely routed, and the rebels captured significant quantities of weapons and provisions. These successes contributed to the further growth of the rebellion. The rebels' territory of control expanded, encompassing the southern regions of Italy. Their army, by some estimates, numbered tens of thousands. However, despite military successes, dissension began to emerge within the rebel movement. Crixus, one of Spartacus's comrades, sought more aggressive action and possibly plunder, while Spartacus, according to historians, had more long-term goals, aimed at freeing his men and perhaps returning to his homeland. As a result of these disagreements, the army split. Crixus and his unit separated from Spartacus and moved in a different direction. Soon, his unit was surrounded and routed by Roman troops. This was the first serious blow to the rebellion. Spartacus, realizing that further stay in Italy was becoming increasingly dangerous, attempted to leave the peninsula. He made a deal with Cilician pirates, who promised to transport him and his army to Sicily, an island where slavery was also widespread, and where Spartacus hoped he could find new supporters. However, the pirates, having received payment, reneged on their promise, abandoning the rebels on the shore. This setback became another serious obstacle to Spartacus's path to freedom. After successfully escaping from the gladiatorial school in Capua, Spartacus and his followers faced the need not only to survive, but also to develop their army. The initial clashes with Roman troops, although won thanks to tactical ingenuity and knowledge of the terrain, showed that they could not rely on random skirmishes forever. The Roman Republic, recognizing the threat, began to assemble larger forces to suppress the rebellion. During this period, in 73 BC, in southern Italy, where slavery was particularly widespread, new recruits began to join Spartacus's army. These were not only gladiators, but also runaway slaves from estates and free peasants whose lives had been devastated by constant warfare and taxes. Each new recruit brought with them their own skills and knowledge. Some knew how to farm, some were skilled in crafts, and some, like the gladiators, had combat experience. Organizing the rebel army became a top priority. Spartacus, himself an experienced warrior, understood the importance of discipline and order. He strove to create the semblance of a real army, where everyone knew their place and followed orders. Initially, their equipment was meager. Gladiators used what they could seize from school, and newcomers brought whatever they could find or steal. Gradually, after each successful skirmish with the Romans, the rebels expanded their arsenals. They captured swords, spears, shields, and helmets. Roman weaponry, though well made, often proved heavier and less comfortable for those accustomed to lighter equipment. The rebels adapted it to their needs, sometimes using lighter armor and shorter swords, which gave them an advantage in maneuverability. Spartacus's tactics were based on exploiting the enemy's weaknesses and his knowledge of the terrain. He often chose narrow gorges or hilly terrain for battle, where the Roman legions, accustomed to fighting on open plains, felt insecure. His army, composed of men accustomed to hard work and resilient, was able to undertake long marches and act quickly. During this period, the first serious clashes with larger Roman forces occurred. The Senate, finally realizing the scale of the threat, dispatched 2 consular armies against the rebels. The consuls that year were Lucius Gellius Publicola and Gnaeus Cornelius Lentulus Clodianus. These armies, each estimated to number between 20 and 30,000 soldiers, were intended to quickly suppress the rebellion. However, despite their numerical superiority, the Romans suffered defeat. One army was routed in battle, where, according to sources, the rebels employed ambush and surprise attack tactics. The other army also suffered heavy losses. These successes were not simply military victories. They have enormous psychological significance. They demonstrated that the Roman military machine was not invincible and gave hope to thousands of slaves across Italy. After these victories, Spartacus's strategy changed. He realized that his army, although strong, could not withstand the full might of Rome for long. He decided to move to southern Italy, to the regions where slavery was most widespread, and where he could hope to find more supporters and better hide from Roman troops. Southern Italy, with its fertile lands and large estates, was an ideal location for attracting runaway slaves. The year was 73 BC, and events were unfolding rapidly. After a daring escape from the gladiatorial school in Capua, Spartacus and his followers, mostly gladiators, found themselves free, but in a very vulnerable position. There were only about 70 of them, but they were armed and determined. The first clashes with the small Roman detachments sent to capture them ended in victory for the rebels. This was not surprising, as the gladiators were trained in the art of combat, and the Roman soldiers, sent in haste, were not always the best fighters. One of the key tactics Spartacus employed early on was exploiting the terrain. He and his men knew how to use hills, forests, and ravines to their advantage. For example, when they were attacked by a Praetorian detachment of 3,000 men under the command of Gaius Claudius Glaber, Spartacus demonstrated his ingenuity. Glaber had set up camp on a mountaintop, blocking the only known escape route. However, as historians recount, Spartacus ordered his men to weave ladders from grapevines and descend the sheer cliff face, outflanking the Romans. The Romans, caught off guard, were completely routed, and the rebels captured significant quantities of weapons and provisions. These successes contributed to the further growth of the rebellion. The rebels' territory of control expanded, encompassing the southern regions of Italy. Their army, by some estimates, numbered in the tens of thousands. However, despite military successes, dissension began to emerge within the rebel movement. Crixus, one of Spartacus's comrades, sought more aggressive action and perhaps plunder, while Spartacus, according to historians, had more long-term goals, aimed at freeing his men and perhaps returning to his homeland. As a result of these disagreements, the army split. Crixus and his unit separated from Spartacus and moved in a different direction. Soon, his unit was surrounded and defeated by Roman troops. This was the first serious blow to the rebellion. Spartacus, realizing that further stay in Italy was becoming increasingly dangerous, attempted to leave the peninsula. He made a deal with Cilician pirates, who promised to transport him and his army to Sicily, an island where slavery was also widespread, and where Spartacus hoped he could find new supporters. However, the pirates, having received payment, did not fulfill their promise, abandoning the rebels on the shore. This failure became another serious obstacle on Spartacus's path to freedom. It was after these events, in 72 BC, that the Roman Republic finally realized the gravity of the threat. The Senate decided to dispatch 2 experienced generals against Spartacus, each with their own legions. These were Gnaeus Pompey, renowned for his military successes in the West, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of Rome's wealthiest men, who sought to strengthen his political career through military victories. Crassus was given command of the majority of Roman forces operating in Italy, and his task was not only to defeat Spartacus's army, but also to prevent its further expansion. Crassus acted decisively. He assembled 8 legions, amounting to approximately 40,000 experienced soldiers. His strategy was to deny Spartacus the opportunity to maneuver and lure him into a trap. Crassus began to strengthen his position, constructing defensive lines and fortified camps. His primary goal was to cut off Spartacus in southern Italy, the so-called cradle of the rebellion. He sought to limit the rebels' access to resources and gain a numerical advantage. While Crassus concentrated his main forces in the south, Gnaeus Pompey was sent to northern Italy. His mission was to intercept any rebel groups that might attempt to break through the Alps, and also to deal with the remnants of Crixus's army, which, as it turned out, had not been completely destroyed in the previous skirmishes. Pompey's actions were aimed more at clearing the area and preventing the rebellion from spreading, while Crassus was tasked with waging a decisive battle. Crassus launched a series of successful operations, defeating several small rebel bands that attempted to break through his lines. His actions at Rhegium, an ancient city in southern Italy, are particularly noteworthy. Here, Crassus managed to besiege and capture the city, where part of Spartacus' army had taken refuge. This victory allowed him to consolidate his control over the region and demonstrate to the Romans that the rebellion would be crushed. Crassus's most ambitious move was the construction of massive fortifications. He ordered the digging of a ditch and the construction of a rampart some 55 kilometers long, which was intended to seal off the entire southern edge of Italy from coast to coast. The goal was clear: to trap Spartacus in this sack and deprive him of the opportunity to retreat or receive reinforcements. It was a monumental feat of engineering, a testament to Rome's determination to put an end to the rebellion. However, as subsequent events demonstrated, even the most formidable fortifications could not stop a man driven by a thirst for freedom. The events of 70 BC marked the final chord in the tragic story of Spartacus's rebellion. After a failed attempt to negotiate with the pirates, and realizing that Crassus had effectively cut him off in southern Italy, Spartacus decided to fight his way north. The reasons for this decision could have been varied. Perhaps he hoped to force Crassus to lift the siege if he himself began threatening the Roman cities in the north. Or perhaps he was simply seeking a way out of the impasse, hoping to find more favorable conditions for further struggle, perhaps even to transport his men across the Alps and return home. The journey north was long and dangerous. Crassus, having learned of Spartacus's intentions, didn't wait for him to reach his fortifications. He launched his troops in pursuit, seeking to intercept the rebels and deal them a decisive blow. During this campaign, several battles took place with Crassus's legates, his closest lieutenants. These battles, while not decisive, demonstrated that Spartacus's army still posed a serious threat. The rebels, despite fatigue and constant skirmishes, maintained their fighting spirit and demonstrated tactical ingenuity. The rebellion culminated in the Battle of Lucania in southern Italy. The exact location of this battle is still a subject of debate among historians, but it is known that the decisive battle took place there. Crassus gathered all his forces, seeking to finally put an end to the rebellion. Spartacus, realizing that there might be no other chance, also threw everything he had into the fight. The tactics of this battle were apparently very fierce. The Roman legionaries, trained in discipline and orderly combat, encountered desperate resistance from the rebels. Plutarch, one of the main sources of information on the rebellion, describes Spartacus himself fighting in the front ranks, fighting his way to Crassus himself. He was wounded in the thigh, but continued to fight, supporting himself with his knee and shield. However, despite his courage, the forces were unequal. The rebels were surrounded and gradually destroyed. Spartacus's death is shrouded in mystery. According to one version, he fell in battle, fighting to his last breath. According to another, his body was never found, fueling rumors of his possible survival. Whatever the truth, his death marked the end of organized resistance. The rebellion, which threatened to undermine the foundations of the Roman Republic, was brutally suppressed. After the defeat of Spartacus's army, the Roman Republic displayed its full cruelty. The goal was not simply to suppress the rebellion, but also to intimidate anyone who might attempt to follow Spartacus's example in the future. Thousands of surviving rebels were captured. 6,000 of them were crucified along the Appian Way, leading from Capua to Rome. It was a horrific spectacle, intended to serve as a perpetual reminder of the consequences of disobedience. Each crucifix was a symbol of suppression, and the road itself became a grim monument to cruelty. For the generals who suppressed the rebellion, this became an opportunity for triumph and strengthening their position. Marcus Licinius Crassus, as the main perpetrator, was given the opportunity to stage a triumphal procession, demonstrating his military might and wealth. Gaius Pompey, who arrived in northern Italy and finished off the remnants of the rebels, also claimed a share of the glory and achieved a triumph, albeit on a smaller scale. These triumphs were more than just celebrations. They were political events demonstrating the power and grandeur of Rome. The consequences of Spartacus's rebellion for the Roman Republic were significant. First, it forced the Romans to reconsider their attitude toward slaves. The threat of such a massive uprising exposed the vulnerability of the slave system. New laws were passed, tightening control over slaves, restricting their movement and assembly. Security measures were strengthened to prevent similar events in the future. Secondly, the revolt had an impact on Roman military affairs. Although the Roman army remained largely invincible, the experience of fighting such a flexible and resourceful force as Spartacus's army forced generals to rethink tactics and strategy. It was realized that even well-trained legions could be defeated if they lacked flexibility and the ability to adapt to changing conditions. Spartacus's rebellion became not only a historical event, but also a powerful symbol. Throughout history, when people fought for their freedom and rights, Spartacus's image became an inspiring example. He evolved from a gladiator turned slave leader into a symbol of the fight against oppression, an indomitable spirit, and the desire for freedom. The sources that tell us about these events are few and often contradictory. The main ones are the works of Plutarch, a Roman historian and biographer who lived a century after the revolt. Also important are Appian, a Greek historian, and Sallust, a Roman historian. By the time the Roman Republic faced the slave revolt, it had already come a long way. For centuries, Rome had expanded its borders, subjugating new lands and peoples. This expansion had profound socio-economic consequences. Slavery became the foundation of the Roman economy. Huge numbers of prisoners of war captured during conquests were turned into slaves who toiled in the fields, mines, workshops, and even in the homes of Roman citizens. The growing number of slaves led to the formation of large landholdings, so-called latifundia. These vast estates, managed by slaves, became increasingly profitable, displacing small landowners and exacerbating social inequality. The situation of slaves was extremely difficult. They were considered the property of their masters, deprived of any rights. Their lives depended solely on the will and mercy of the owner. Roman military might was one of the reasons for its dominance. The legions, disciplined and well-trained, became an instrument of conquest and the maintenance of order. Military service was an honorable duty for Roman citizens, and traditions of loyalty, courage, and fortitude were instilled in them from childhood. Conquests brought Rome not only new territories, but also enormous wealth and an influx of slaves, perpetuating a vicious cycle. Gladiatorial games held a special place in Roman culture. They weren't just entertainment, but also an important part of public life, a way to demonstrate strength and courage, and a way to distract the population from pressing problems. Gladiators were most often slaves, prisoners of war, or convicted criminals. Their training was rigorous and lengthy. They trained in special schools where they learned to use various weapons and combat techniques. Gladiators' living conditions were harsh, but at the same time they enjoyed a certain fame and even respect among the crowd, especially if they achieved victories. It was in this environment that the rebellion arose. The identity of Spartacus, the protagonist of these events, is shrouded in mystery. According to one version, he was a Thracian warrior who fell into Roman slavery. Others suggest he served in the auxiliary troops of the Roman army, from which he deserted or was captured. His origins may have been noble, which could explain his leadership qualities and ability to lead men. Other sources point to his affiliation with a tribe of gladiators, whose lives were filled with struggle and suffering, which undoubtedly forged his character. In 1730 BC, the city of Capua was home to one of the renowned gladiatorial schools, owned by Lentulus Batiatus. It was here that the rebellion began. Dissatisfied with the conditions and the prospect of death in the arena, a group of about 70 gladiators, led by Spartacus, Crixus, and Onomaus, decided to escape. The organization was meticulously planned, despite meager resources. They managed to seize kitchen weapons and break out of the school. Their initial successes were due to their combat experience and the surprise of the attack. They managed to defeat a small detachment sent to capture them and seize Roman weapons and armor. Spartacus, Crixus, and Onomus became the key leaders of the rebels. Spartacus likely possessed the greatest authority and strategic vision. Crixus was possibly his closest ally, and Onomus, judging by his name, was of Germanic origin and also enjoyed the respect of the fighters. The initial clashes with Roman troops demonstrated that despite the Romans' numerical superiority and superior weapons, the rebels, driven by desperate courage and a desire for freedom, could achieve victory. Their tactics often involved elements of guerrilla warfare, surprise attacks, and knowledge of the terrain. The rebellion gained momentum. New supporters began to join the gladiators. Runaway slaves from nearby estates, peasants dispossessed of their land, and even freedmen dissatisfied with their situation saw in Spartacus the hope of liberation. The rebel army grew, and Spartacus was forced to organize it. He sought to instill discipline in his fighters and teach them how to use captured Roman weapons and armor. The rebels' tactics became increasingly sophisticated, and they learned to fight against regular Roman troops. The Roman authorities, underestimating the threat, initially sent small expeditionary forces against the rebels. However, these detachments, consisting of Praetorian Guard and other units, were unable to overcome Spartacus's army. The legates commanding these corps were defeated. This came as a shock to Rome. In 1730 BC, following a series of successful battles, Spartacus's army defeated a Praetorian detachment under the command of Gaius Claudius Glaber. This was followed by the defeat of another detachment under Publius Varinius. These victories allowed the rebels to seize significant quantities of weapons, provisions, and horses, significantly strengthening their forces. Spartacus's strategic decisions have been controversial among historians. After initial successes, he decided to advance to southern Italy. His goal was likely not so much the conquest of Rome as achieving freedom and evacuating his supporters from Italy. Southern Italy, with its intricate coastline and large slave population, offered favorable territory for replenishing his army and finding escape routes. The rebels' military successes continued in 1073 and 1072 BC. One of the most famous battles took place at Mount Vesuvius. The Romans, confident in their strength, surrounded Spartacus's camp, believing they had trapped him. However, Spartacus displayed remarkable ingenuity. He ordered his men to weave ladders from wild grapevines and descend a sheer cliff face, which the Romans considered impassable. The Romans, unprepared for such a maneuver, were caught off guard and routed. The rebels captured their camp, weapons, and equipment, which became a valuable asset. Following this victory, the rebels' territory expanded, encompassing most of southern Italy. Rumors of Spartacus's successes spread, attracting even more refugees. However, dissension began to emerge within the rebel ranks. Some of the rebels, primarily Gauls and Germans, led by Crixus, sought plunder and a return to their homeland, while Spartacus is believed to have had more long-term goals. Crixus broke away with his group, some 30,000 men, and headed toward Apulia. There he was defeated by a Roman army under the consul Lucius Gellius Publicola. Faced with the growing power of the Roman army and internal dissension, Spartacus attempted to leave Italy. He intended to cross to Sicily, where he hoped to find support among the local population, also suffering from slavery. To this end, he entered into an agreement with the Cilician pirates who controlled the sea routes. However, after receiving Spartacus's payment, the pirates failed to fulfill their obligations and did not deliver his army to Sicily. This dealt a serious blow to Spartacus's plans. The Roman Republic finally recognized the gravity of the threat. It was decided to send a larger force against Spartacus. In 172 BC, 2 proconsuls were appointed to Rome: Gnaeus Pompey, a renowned general, and Marcus Licinius Crassus, one of Rome's wealthiest men who aspired to military glory. Crassus was given command of the main army, numbering approximately 40,000 legionaries. Crassus's strategy was aimed at isolating Spartacus and denying him the possibility of retreat. He began fortifying his positions in southern Italy, attempting to cut off the rebels from the rest of the peninsula. Crassus decided to build powerful fortifications, a ditch and rampart, on the Isthmus of Bruttium, which separated Calabria from the rest of Italy. The goal was to trap Spartacus's army at the southern tip of Italy. Meanwhile, Crassus besieged and captured the city of Rhegium, which had supported Spartacus. This deprived the rebels of a vital strategic point. Pompey's actions were aimed at combating the remnants of Crixus's army and intercepting fugitives. After Crixus's defeat, Pompey, returning from Spain, received orders to deal with the remaining rebels. He successfully routed small groups of slaves attempting to break through to the north, thereby helping to suppress the rebellion. It was 1071 BC, the last year of the revolt. Spartacus, trapped in southern Italy, decided to fight his way north. The reasons for this decision could have been varied. Perhaps he hoped to find a route to the Alps and cross them to lead his people out of Italy. Or perhaps he sought to make a final stand against the Roman legions, demonstrating his strength and his desire for freedom. Spartacus's army, despite its losses, still represented a significant force. He engaged in a series of battles with Crassus's legates. In these battles, the rebels demonstrated resilience and resourcefulness, but the Roman legions, under the experienced command of Crassus, gradually gained the upper hand. The decisive battle took place in Lucania, in southern Italy. The exact location is unknown, but the course of the battle was dramatic. Spartacus, according to Plutarch, fought with exceptional courage. He sought to reach Crassus himself, intending to kill him and thereby decide the outcome of the battle. However, surrounded by Roman soldiers, he fell in battle. The circumstances of his death remain a matter of debate. Some sources say he was killed in the melee, while others say his body was never found, giving rise to legends of his survival. The consequences of the revolt were brutal. The Roman Republic sought not only to suppress the uprising, but also to intimidate anyone who might contemplate a similar rebellion in the future. Thousands of rebels were captured and subjected to horrific executions. On Crassus's orders, some 6,000 captive slaves were crucified along the Appian Way, from Capua to Rome. It was a horrific spectacle, intended to sow terror and serve as a warning. For suppressing the rebellion, Crassus and Pompey received rewards. Crassus, as the leading general, held a triumph in Rome, demonstrating his military prowess. Pompey, having routed the remnants of Crixus's army, also had the opportunity to celebrate his victory. Both generals used their success against Spartacus to strengthen their political influence. Spartacus's rebellion had a profound impact on Roman attitudes toward slaves. The threat of such a massive and organized uprising exposed the vulnerability of the slave system. New laws were passed, tightening control over slaves, restricting their movement and assembly. Security measures were strengthened to prevent similar events in the future. The revolt also had an impact on Roman military affairs. Although the Roman army remained largely invincible, the experience of fighting such a flexible and resourceful force as Spartacus's army forced generals to rethink tactics and strategy. It was realized that even well-trained legions could be defeated if they lacked flexibility and the ability to adapt to changing conditions. Spartacus became not only a historical event, but also a powerful symbol. Throughout history, when people fought for their freedom and rights, Spartacus's image became an inspiring example. He evolved from a gladiator-turned-slave leader into a symbol of the fight against oppression, an indomitable spirit, and the desire for freedom. The sources that tell us about these events are few and often contradictory. The primary ones are the works of Plutarch, a Roman historian and biographer who lived a century after the revolt. Also important are Appian, a Greek historian, and Sallust, a Roman historian. These ancient authors, each from their own perspective, described the events, but the details of their accounts sometimes differ. Spartacus has become the embodiment of the struggle for freedom in culture and history. His image has been interpreted differently in different eras. In antiquity, he was primarily a gladiator who led a rebellion. In later times, particularly during the Age of Enlightenment and the 19th century, he became a symbol of popular rebellion against tyranny. His story has inspired writers, artists, and directors. From classical works to modern films, the image of Spartacus lives on, reminding us of the strength of the human spirit and the eternal struggle for dignity. Spartacus's rebellion, despite its tragic outcome, left an indelible mark on history. It was more than just a slave revolt, but a powerful manifestation of a yearning for freedom that could not be completely suppressed. It demonstrated that even in the most difficult circumstances, people are capable of fighting for their right to life and dignity. A brief overview of the main stages of the revolt includes its beginnings in the gladiatorial school of Capua, the rapid growth of the slave army, successful battles against Roman expeditionary forces, Spartacus's attempts to leave Italy, and finally, the decisive battle against superior Roman forces. The long-term impact of Spartacus's revolt on Roman history was manifested in the tightening of slave control, as well as the rethinking of certain aspects of military tactics. Spartacus's decision to break north was dictated by a complex strategic situation. The winter of 172 BC brought cold and famine. The rebel army, though numerous, suffered from a shortage of food and supplies. Roman forces, under the command of Marcus Licinius Crassus, were steadily tightening their siege in Bruttium, southern Italy. Crassus, the richest man in Rome, sought not only to suppress the rebellion, but also to gain military glory, which would allow him to rise in Roman politics. Crassus, acting methodically and cautiously, erected impressive fortifications. He constructed a ditch and rampart some 55 kilometers long, stretching across the Isthmus of Bruttium. This defensive line was intended to cut Spartacus and his army off from the rest of Italy, forcing them to either surrender or accept battle on unfavorable terms. The siege dragged on, and the rebels' situation grew increasingly desperate. Spartacus, recognizing the danger, launched a desperate breakout attempt. He chose the coldest and darkest time of year, hoping for surprise. At night, under the cover of a snowstorm, the rebels attempted to breach the Roman fortifications. Some units managed to break through, but many were killed or captured. This breakthrough, though partially successful, cost Spartacus significant losses and demonstrated the Romans' resolve. After this unsuccessful breakthrough, Spartacus decided to move north. Perhaps he hoped to reach the Alps and lead his men out of Italy, or perhaps to find allies among the Gallic and Germanic tribes. His army, weakened but still formidable, headed for Lucania. At this time, Gnaeus Pompey, another distinguished Roman general, was returning from the war in Spain. He had received orders to intercept any groups of rebels who might attempt to flee north. Pompey, renowned for his discipline and efficiency, was ready to meet them. Crassus wasted no time pursuing Spartacus's army. He sought to prevent the rebels from regrouping and deal them a decisive blow. In a series of skirmishes, the Roman legions subordinate to Crassus achieved local victories, gradually wearing down Spartacus's army. The Battle of Lucania was a turning point. Its exact location is unknown, but it was Spartacus's last major engagement. The rebel army, though it had fought with incredible bravery, was already significantly weakened. The Roman legions, better armed and organized, clearly had a numerical superiority. Spartacus, as always, fought in the forefront, inspiring his warriors. He was a gladiator accustomed to combat, and his personal courage was undeniable. However, the Romans' tactical superiority, discipline, and numbers ultimately proved decisive. During the battle, a tragic incident occurred. A detachment under Crixus, which had previously separated from the main army, was routed by the Romans. This weakened Spartacus's army and possibly undermined its morale. During the decisive battle, Spartacus, according to historians, attempted to reach Crassus himself to confront him personally. He was wounded but continued to fight. Ultimately, he fell in battle, surrounded by enemies. The exact circumstances of his death remain unclear, but all sources agree that he died fighting. After Spartacus's death, the remnants of his army were scattered. Roman troops completed the rout, pursuing and eliminating the fugitives. Pompey, having arrived in Italy, also contributed to the suppression of the uprising, intercepting groups of rebels attempting to escape. Thus, the campaign of 1071 BC became the final act in the dramatic story of Spartacus and his rebellion. Despite heroic resistance, the forces were unequal, and Rome, with its powerful military machine, prevailed. However, Spartacus's legacy as a freedom fighter proved far more enduring than the Roman Republic itself. After Spartacus fell in battle and his army was scattered, the Roman Republic began the final phase of suppressing the rebellion. This phase was marked not only by military action, but also by brutal intimidation measures designed to demonstrate the strength and ruthlessness of the Roman state. The brunt of the suppression fell on Marcus Licinius Crassus, who commanded a significant force. His strategy was not just to defeat, but to completely eradicate any possible resistance. After Spartacus's main army was routed, the Romans began a systematic hunt for the remaining rebels. Thousands of runaway slaves who had joined the rebellion were captured. To remind everyone of the consequences of disobedience, the Romans resorted to mass executions. The most horrific manifestation of this cruelty was crucifixion. Thousands of crosses were erected along the Appian Way, one of the main arteries leading into Rome. Each cross was hung with a captured slave. It was a spectacle designed to strike fear into the hearts of anyone who might ever consider rebellion. Historians estimate that the number of those executed reached 6,000. This was not just a punishment, but a demonstration of Rome's absolute power, which brooked no challenges to its authority. Beyond executions, the Romans ensured that those who had participated in suppressing the rebellion received their just reward. Marcus Licinius Crassus, who played a key role in the campaign, received enormous booty and the opportunity to hold a triumphal procession in Rome. This was the highest honor for a commander who had ended the war with victory. The triumph was a grand celebration, demonstrating the power and grandeur of Rome and highlighting Crassus's achievements. Gnaeus Pompey, who had returned from Spain, also claimed credit, as his troops had intercepted groups of fugitives attempting to escape. However, the main credit went to Crassus, which later played a role in their political rivalry. Spartacus's rebellion, although suppressed, had a profound impact on Roman attitudes toward slaves. Until then, slavery had been viewed as a natural part of society, the foundation of the economy. However, such a large-scale rebellion demonstrated how fragile this system could be. Roman authorities became even more vigilant. Measures were taken to tighten control over slaves. The conditions of slaves' keeping and working, especially in agriculture, could become even harsher. Slave owners were forced to pay greater attention to security measures to prevent further escapes or rebellions. Overall, Spartacus's rebellion served as a wake-up call for the Roman elite, demonstrating that even the most oppressed strata of society could pose a serious threat. The revolt's impact was not limited to relations between masters and slaves. It also had repercussions on Roman politics and military affairs. The political prestige of Crassus and Pompey was significantly enhanced by their role in suppressing the rebellion, strengthening their positions in the Roman Senate and in the struggle for power. Militarily, while the Roman army demonstrated its strength, the revolt also demonstrated that even well-organized and disciplined troops could face serious challenges from a motivated enemy. The tactics employed by Spartacus, such as his ability to quickly mobilize and train men, as well as his skill in exploiting the terrain, were certainly noted by Roman generals. Although the Roman military machine ultimately proved superior, the lessons learned from this conflict may have contributed to the further development of military tactics and strategy. Spartacus's revolt was one of the most significant events in the history of the Roman Republic, demonstrating both its strength and vulnerability and leaving a deep imprint on the public consciousness. Spartacus's rebellion, one of the most striking events in the history of ancient Rome, left an indelible mark not only on the chronicles, but also on the collective consciousness of humanity. Its story, shrouded in legend and reimagined through the ages, continues to excite and inspire. Today, we turn to the 8th part of our narrative to examine how Spartacus's rebellion has transformed culture and history, transforming from a real historical event into a powerful symbol. Our primary sources of information on the revolt come from Roman historians who lived shortly after the events. Among them, the most important are Plutarch, Appian, and Sallust. Plutarch, a Greek historian and biographer, in his Parallel Lives, provides a detailed account of Spartacus, his personality, and the course of the revolt. Written with a keen understanding of human psychology, his work often focuses on the characters and their motivations. Appian, a Roman historian of Greek descent, also described the revolt in detail in his Roman history, focusing on its military aspects and political consequences. Sallust, a Roman historian known for his works on the Catiline conspiracy and the Jugurthan War, also mentioned the slave revolt, although unfortunately his work has not survived in its entirety. These ancient authors, despite possible biases associated with their Roman citizenship, provide us with a foundation for understanding the scale and significance of this monumental event. Spartacus, through his resistance, became the embodiment of the struggle for freedom. His image has been interpreted differently across different eras. For some, he was a simple gladiator who took up arms against his oppressors. For others, he was a brilliant military leader who was able to unite disparate groups of slaves and challenge the mighty Roman Empire. During the Renaissance, when interest in antiquity was revived, Spartacus became associated with the ideas of humanism and the struggle for individual rights. During the Age of Enlightenment, when the ideas of freedom and equality acquired particular relevance, his image became a symbol of the popular uprising against tyranny. In the 19th century, a period of social upheaval and revolution, Spartacus was perceived as a hero, inspiring the oppressed to fight for their rights. His story found particular resonance in the Soviet Union, where Spartacus was presented as a revolutionary, a fighter for social justice, and a harbinger of class struggle. This multifaceted image of Spartacus allows us to see him not just as a historical figure, but as an eternal symbol of the desire for freedom and dignity. The story of Spartacus has been reflected in countless works of art. Literature, film, theater, and painting have all addressed the theme of the slave rebellion. One of the most famous literary works dedicated to Spartacus is Giovanni Arrigo Boiardo's novel Spartacus, written in the 15th century. Later in the 20th century, Raffaello Giovagnoli's celebrated book, Spartacus, was published, exerting a profound influence on the popular perception of the rebellious gladiator. Written in the genre of historical fiction, this book powerfully describes Spartacus's exploits and tragedy. In film, Spartacus has been portrayed by many actors. The most famous is, of course, the 1960 Hollywood film Spartacus, directed by Stanley Kubrick and starring Kirk Douglas. Despite some historical liberties, this film has become a classic and has largely shaped modern audiences' understanding of the rebellion. Also worth mentioning is the 1953 Italian film Spartacus, starring Jean Marais. Spartacus's image has also attracted the attention of artists in painting. For example, Jean-Léon Gérôme's Spartacus depicts a gladiator before a fight. These works of art, each in their own way, help us more deeply understand and feel the spirit of the era and the tragedy of the protagonist. The significance of Spartacus's rebellion for understanding the ancient world is difficult to overstate. It demonstrated that even the most powerful empire is not immune to internal threats. The rebellion demonstrated that oppression, no matter how brutal, cannot completely suppress the human desire for freedom. For the Romans, accustomed to considering themselves the pinnacle of civilization, this was a profound lesson. It forced them to rethink their attitude toward slaves, although it did not lead to immediate, radical changes in the slave system. Instead, as we have already mentioned, the rebellion was followed by stricter controls and increased security. On the other hand, Spartacus's rebellion became a powerful symbol that has inspired freedom fighters for centuries. It reminded the world that history is written not only by the victors, but also by those who dare to challenge injustice. The story of Spartacus is more than just a slave rebellion. This is a story about the human spirit, about the unbending will to freedom, which, even when suppressed, continues to live in memory and inspire future generations. We have reached the end of our journey through the turbulent times of the Roman Republic, an era marked by the revolt of Spartacus. The story of this great conflict, which began with the escape of a handful of gladiators from Lentulus Batiatus's school in Capua in 73 BC, unfolded into a massive movement that engulfed much of Italy. We traced how Spartacus, his comrades Crixus and Oenomaus, and then Spartacus himself, managed to unite thousands of runaway slaves, peasants, and freedmen under their banner, creating an army that for 2 years challenged the might of Rome. We saw how this army, despite the lack of regular training and professional weapons, demonstrated remarkable resilience and tactical ingenuity. The Battle of Vesuvius, where the rebels, exploiting the natural terrain, managed to defeat the Roman legions, became a shining example of their fighting spirit. We witnessed how Spartacus, seeking to lead his men out of Italy, encountered the treachery of Cilician pirates, leading to tragic consequences. The history of the revolt also showed us how Rome, faced with an unprecedented threat, mobilized its best forces. The appointment of such experienced generals as Marcus Licinius Crassus and Gnaeus Pompeius testifies to the gravity of the situation. We examined their strategic decisions aimed at suppressing the revolt, including the construction of massive fortifications designed to cut off Spartacus in the southern part of the peninsula. And finally, we touched on the final, decisive stage of this dramatic story, the campaign of 71 BC, which culminated in the Battle of Lucania. This battle, despite the heroism of the rebels, ended in their defeat, and Spartacus himself, according to ancient authors, fell in battle, fighting to the last. The consequences of this rebellion were severe. Rome, seeking to demonstrate its strength and prevent similar events in the future, resorted to brutal measures. Thousands of rebels were crucified along the Appian Way, a grim reminder of the price of disobedience. Crassus and Pompey, victorious, received well-deserved triumphs, strengthening their position in Roman politics. However, despite the brutality of the suppression, Spartacus's rebellion left an indelible mark. It forced Roman society to reflect on the problems of slavery, though it did not lead to immediate fundamental changes. Rather, it resulted in stricter controls and enhanced security measures. Culturally, Spartacus has become an enduring symbol of the struggle for freedom and dignity. Sources such as the writings of Plutarch, Appian, and Sallust have brought us accounts of this event, allowing us to study and understand it. Spartacus's image has inspired writers, artists, and directors throughout the centuries, appearing in literature, painting, and cinema. From classical works to modern interpretations, his story continues to move and provoke thought. Spartacus's rebellion is more than just a chapter in ancient history. It is a story of the indomitable human spirit, of the yearning for freedom that, even when suppressed, continues to live on in memory and inspire. It demonstrated that even the most powerful empire cannot completely extinguish the thirst for freedom in the hearts of men. It is a powerful reminder that history is shaped not only by the actions of the victors, but also by the courage of those who dare to challenge injustice. Our journey through the history of the Roman Republic and the Spartacus Revolt concludes, leaving behind a profound understanding of the past. We have seen how complex social and economic processes, military might, and human aspirations intertwined to shape the course of history. Now, as we conclude our narrative, let only the calm echo of past events remain in your mind. Let the images of the ancient world, full of grandeur and struggle, give way to a quiet peace. The history of Rome, like the history of any great civilizational journey, is full of lessons, but ultimately, all these lessons lead to an understanding of the cyclical nature of time and the immutability of human aspirations. Let this knowledge, gained in silence and tranquility, become part of your inner world, bringing a sense of completeness and peace. Let every sound, every word spoken here, lull you into a deep and restful sleep. Let the ancient world, with its majestic cities, mighty armies, and unwavering spirits, remain but a quiet, distant echo, fading into the serene night. Sleep peacefully.